We're here today with Pastor Garrett Lear, the Patriot Pastor, and welcome, Garrett. You have a fascinating story. I mean, for one, you were born in, I'd like you to get into the story about growing up in Lexington, Mass, where you were born.
Well, I will have no other king but King Jesus. That's always my byword, you might say.
Okay.
I mean that in the most respectful manner because it was one of the most prominent sayings during the War for American Independence. And you may notice, Walter, that I didn't call it the Revolutionary War because people misunderstand really what it was about.
Did they call it that at that time? They referred to it as the War of Independence?
Yeah, they called it
predominantly.
that. And here's one of the proof texts to find that out. It's the Declaration of Independence. It's not the declaration of war, it was a Declaration of Independence, which of course, in a sense,
that's interesting.
Started the war. I mean, it wasn't the beginning of the war because the war started before that, really, at the Battle of Lexington, April 19th, 1775. And of course, for me, being born in Lexington was pretty interesting, and probably like most American kids, you know, you take for granted the liberties and freedoms that you have and live around a historical place like that. I was pretty old before I ever actually went into some of those historical places because I figured, well, who cares, you know? But I always did have a particular fascination for the Lexington Minuteman. And for any of our viewers that go to Lexington, you come up Massachusetts Avenue, which is the actual route that the British took, coming to fight against the colonials on the green against those Lexington Minutemen. And so the statue that's there, I mean, I used to look up at it as a boy passing by, and I'd say, now that's a fine figure of a man. And the interesting thing about it, anyone can relate to it because it's not white, it's not red, it's not black, it's not brown, it's not yellow, it's green.
Yeah.
Everyone can relate to it. And it was Captain John Parker, actually.
Who the model was taken from.
Yeah.
And when was that? When did they cast that statue?
Actually, that was in the 1800s. It seemed that a lot of the monuments after the War of 1812, in particular, the country started to realize, you know, a lot of the people that fought in the War for American Independence were dying, and a lot of documents, and of course you may know this, that in the War of 1812, the British marched on Washington and they marched on the Capitol, and what they were intending to do was to take all of our foundational documents that were being stored there. That was before the Smithsonian and the National Archives and whatever, and Dolly Madison, our fourth president's wife, slipped out the back door, so to speak.
Paintings and everything.
Yeah, but she mostly was concerned to save the documents, the original documents. They wanted to burn them because in the history of the world, nobody had had documents like that. No other people had ever had anything like that. So the British were so upset about it, they burned them, or they wanted to burn them, and they burned the White House, of course. So I think a lot of people in America then said, we need to commemorate what these people did, put it in granite. You know, also down in Plymouth, a lot of the things that have happened in Plymouth were in the early 19th century when people said we need to make sure that this is in stone so our posterity will know.
Well, tell us a little more about Lexington, growing up there, and what you've uncovered just from you. I know you've done extensive historical research there, and a sermon of Jonas Clark, who was the minister of the town.
Well, when I was growing up in Lexington, I was born in 1948. It was just a small town where most everybody knew each other. And of course, every year around April 19th, we had the reenactment and the parade and so forth and so on. And that was a big activity in Lexington without most people really fully understanding what the meaning of it was. Of course, for children, and if their parents are going to teach them, my parents really didn't ever say anything about it. It's just I myself was always a great history buff and from my childhood a great reader. And so I started reading these things, and it was just very fascinating. Particularly, you mentioned the Patriot pastor Jonas Clark, who, of all the Patriot pastors, I consider him to be the most influential. And to me, he's my favorite, my all-time favorite. Basically because he was a village parson in a small village. small town. Yet that small town, and we know from different documentation, that was the shot heard around the world. And they believed that what they did on the village green, and one of my ancestors, Jedediah Learned, was a Minuteman.
Was at that green that morning.
Lexington alarm list. And, you know, we're not exactly sure how many, this sort of debatable issue, but somewhere around 77 Minutemen against 700 Redcoats. You know, when people said the British are coming, no, it was actually they're saying the Redcoats are coming because, let's say, for example, today, you know, in American military, if you heard that the Navy SEALs were coming or the Delta Force is coming or the Green Berets are coming, that's different. That's the top military force, best equipped. Well, that's who was coming against Lexington.
And these were like the King's Own, the ones that were, I mean, they're top force, right?
Yeah, they were coming on purpose to scare those people. And you got to figure, the people that turned out in the green, they weren't trained soldiers, although from 16 to 60, everybody had certain training in the militia.
Right.
But these were the butcher, baker, and the candlestick maker. And Jonas Clark was just a village parson. I mean, he was well trained and in theology and came out of Harvard and so forth and was very well respected and well known in the area. But he had a farm. He had, I don't know how many children, 12 children, I think. And he got caught up in something that he never expected to be caught up in.
What I found it interesting, I just read this the other day, the book that I got from you, on that first eyewitness account of what happened there from Jonas Clark on that year, I think it was the year.
The one year anniversary.
And what I found interesting, and the propaganda that came out from the British on not knowing who fired that first shot, that it seemed pretty clear from his account that the British had loaded all their weapons a quarter-mile back.
Oh, yeah.
And the Minutemen they hadn't loaded theirs yet, had they?
Well, they didn't want to fight.
And it was one of the British officers that fired that shot. And
it was said that it came out of the Buckman Tavern across the street in
that's
Upper Window.
British
but
account,
I believe that the British fired the shot. I mean, with all my heart today, I believe the British fired the first shot and tried to blame it on the colonials.
Didn't John Parker tell them they were disbanding them?
Well, he actually said to them, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they want a war, let it begin here. I mean, the attitude was they knew they were outgunned.
Yeah.
They knew that they weren't trained like that, and they knew the people were going to die. 8 of them died there in the green. And of course, the British also did something else pretty nasty. There was a type of bayonet that was really basically outlawed in Europe as being so mean-spirited. It was like a triangular bayonet. Guaranteed that if you got stabbed with that bayonet, you'd have an infection or sepsis and, you know, probably die.
What do you mean triangular bayonet?
The way the bayonet was shaped, instead of like a blade, because a lot of blades, when they go in, they can be pulled out and the flesh closes up, but the triangular bayonet leaves a jagged wound. And the British were using it. And it was for no other reason than to scare the butcher, baker, and the candlestick maker into submission. That was what Lexington was about. But see, what they underestimated, I mean, he's paid soldiers coming from England over here. Most of them had never been to the colonies before. And it's not their home. Their home was England. And they came over here and they found out that these people, though they weren't as well trained, they weren't as well equipped, they didn't have good firearms, but they had the motivation. They were fighting for themselves, their families, and for their own homes. And of course, before the day was done, on April 19, 1775, the British, if it had not been that they had broken ranks and started to run all the way back to Charlestown, I don't think one of them would have survived, because they started saying, they're behind every tree, they're behind every rock. So it was pretty interesting what happened.
And that night before, Jonas Clark, Samuel Adams and John Hancock were at the pastor's home.
That's right.
That's where they were staying. So
that's true.
Tell us a little bit about that connection there.
Well, John Hancock was actually a relative by marriage of Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark married the granddaughter of John Hancock, who had been pastor in Lexington, who was grandfather to the John Hancock who was the signer of the Declaration. So Mrs. Clark was John Hancock, the signer's cousin. So they were friends. Who influenced who is hard to say, but my belief is that actually Jonas Clark strongly influenced John Hancock, who was a wealthy merchant, by the way, and he was in government. There was really nothing in it for him to go into the colonial cause except to lose his life and lose everything.
And he was close friends, but one of his best friends with Samuel Adams.
And Samuel Adams was basically known as the father of the American War. You know, they call it American Revolution or American War for Independence. He was the father. He was a great Puritan descendant, very principled man and so forth, not the way some people portray him today. And so they were at the pastor's house, which is kind of interesting by today's standards, because you think, I mean, those two who were, you know, they were disobeying the government, that they were at the pastor's house. Well, not only were they at the pastor's house, the pastor had most of the muskets and everything for the people, and practically everybody in the Lexington Minutemen was in his congregation. And John Parker was a deacon in that church.
And isn't it true that the colonial churches at that time had racks they were required by colonial statute to bring their firearms to church with them?
Well, all the way back in the Plymouth colony, you would be fined 25 shillings as a slothful Christian if you didn't bring your musket. And basically, I mean, if you think about the situation that they were facing in some of the wilderness areas, and there were, you know, some of the Indians were friendly, and some of the Indians weren't friendly.
Oh, it was also like they prepare them for French invasion,
and
too,
French invasion and Spanish invasion,
whatever.
And whoever. I mean, obviously to protect your homeland. So also the biblical principle in Luke chapter 22 that self-defense is legitimate. And see,
is that when Jesus talked about, you know,
sell your cloak and buy a sword?
Yeah.
I mean, so this was an interesting thing, because there have been some Christians throughout the world that have not believed that self-defense was legitimate, or opposing an enemy who's trying to kill you or kill your family. And of course, even to this day, certain constitutions, like the New Hampshire Constitution, provides for that protection, that you wouldn't be a good citizen, not only to protect yourself, but also to be called upon. That's where the Minuteman or the alarm list came from. That they had to help each other in those small communities. You know, people weren't living isolated lives, although they may be separate. Remember, in those days, somebody could be in the community and be living 10 miles away from the village green. So there would be times where they ring the belfry and they call and say, hey, come and help me, there's a fire, come and help me, there's an attack, or come and help me, there's sickness, or whatever.
So they'd ring the bell and that was the alarm?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, the belfry was used as an alarm. I mean, there were some other alarms too, and having the riders like John Dawes and Paul Revere and the other riders to send messages out to the people who were too far to hear the bell.
Now, what were they doing there that far out? Is it because the British had a price on their head, Sam Adams and Hancock?
Well,
were they just visiting?
That's a very good question. I believe that they were at the point they had been warned. Dr. Warren had told them that the British were coming, the Redcoats were coming, and I believe that they went out to talk to Jonas Clark because he was so influential, not only in his own community, but on all the communities around. And they asked him a question, which is interesting, would give me an indication what their real reason for being there was. And it wasn't just a polite visit. They said, trouble's coming, the Redcoats are on their way, will your men fight? And he said, yes, of course they will. I've trained them to, and they will fight. Which obviously they did, and they fought very valiantly. 8 of them dying on that green that are buried there, actually, even to this day. That the Commonwealth of Massachusetts spent money at a time when they were trying to commemorate things. To this day, I don't think the Commonwealth probably would. But then they did, and they're buried right there in the green where they fell. Well,
I think of
it's a pretty amazing thing. You had mentioned about John Hancock and Samuel Adams about being hung. There was no doubt about it that there was a handsome bounty on their heads. And the British did have some advanced intelligence. Remember that probably in the neighborhood of 1/3 of the colonials were on the side of the British. This was a civil war.
Right.
See, people look at it as a war of foreign aggression, but it wasn't.
No, civil war.
It was a civil war.
They were British subjects.
Yeah. And so a third of the people were what we would call today, and even then what they called Tories or British loyalists. If you were British, you'd call them loyalists, and if you were a colonist, you'd call them a Tory or a traitor.
Right.
And they were giving intelligence to the Redcoats, and so they knew that Samuel Adams and John Hancock had gone out to Lexington like that, and it would have been a great capture for them because you would have gotten two of the most important leaders at that point.
Well, what about the Jonas Clark? He was considered part of this black regiment. Is that what the British referred to him as?
It was known
Black Regiment? Or
either the Black Robed Regiment or the Black Regiment. And this is kind of interesting because actually Sir Hugo Walpole, who was Prime Minister at the time under George III, actually said to the king, when the king says, well, what's going on here? I mean, you know, these are my colonies. I own them. They're British subjects. What's this trouble? And the Prime Minister said to him, well, my lord, methinks that cousin America has been led astray by, or has run off with a Presbyterian parson. So that's where the Black Robe Regiment or the Black Regiment came from, because they wore black like I'm dressed in right now.
Presbyterian.
Well, basically,
Presbyterian?
Not all, but
Congregationalists.
the way that the English king looked at it then was because they weren't Anglicans doing this, because all of them were dotting
Church
their
of
I's
England,
and crossing their T's and doing what the king had told them to do, which was to take a license to preach and never preach anything.
Oh, that's another thing. You mean you don't need a license to preach? You know?
Well, King George said you did. The issue that I would say to any magistrate, okay, and I know that's an old-fashioned word, but you know, any governor, any senator, any president, any congressman, take my hand and take my index finger on my right hand and put my finger on the law. If we look at our Constitution, and we still have one, the First Amendment says, how many laws can Congress make concerning None. How many is that?
Congress shall make no laws.
0.
Concerning?
None. And so the issue is, if Congress in some way, or some government agency, whether it's the IRS or some bureaucracy, circumvents the intent of Congress and the intent of our Congress, or our founding documents like the Constitution, then it's no law at all.
It's non-law.
And that's what's happened.
It's what.
And see, the issue is a matter of control, just like in the days with King George.
Sure.
He wanted to make sure, because what was happening was there were certain preachers, like Jonas Clark for one, Jonathan Mayhew, Samuel West. I mean, there were dozens of them, literally. Some of them were Lutheran, some of them were Puritan or Congregational, some of them were Baptist, some of them were Presbyterian. A few were Anglican, but not many, because the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, the head of that church is the king, the King of England, or the Queen of England, as it is today. So they were reluctant to speak against their leader. But the others, and that's why Prime Minister Walpole called it a Presbyterian revolt. It's because of John Knox in Scotland, John Calvin in Europe, and basically what would be called Reformed theology, where they said that any time that a civil magistrate is tyrannical and does not rule according to what the Bible says, then he should be removed. And if you remember, and the history of America actually goes way back in English common law. We can find this, you know, by reading Blackstone's commentary on the law, or for example, reading a foundational document like the Magna Carta. In the year 1215, on the plains of Runnymede, where a tyrannical king named John, King John, was approached by Christian noblemen that said, you will either govern righteously as a righteous civil magistrate according to what the Bible says, or else we'll remove you. And he signed the Magna Carta. And so our founding fathers knew that. They knew the history of governments. They knew, they were very well knowledgeable on these things. So there were some who said, no, we will not take a license to preach. And of course, they were preaching things against the king.
Well, I'd heard a story from Virginia, you probably aware of this, and
the Muhlenbergs.
Patrick Henry had come through town, and was watching someone in the middle of town square being whipped with a cat and nine tails.
That's right, by the British.
Yeah, and the flesh would rip the flesh right off their back with the bits of metal and bone in it. And he wanted to know what this man had done.
Yeah, he said, what's the man's crime?
Yeah, and he said, well, he wouldn't get a license to be...
He was preaching without a license.
Yeah.
Well, also James Madison.
Wasn't a Church of England.
Yeah. Well,
today
it wasn't
we
just
have
a matter of
the
Church
license.
of
The license today is a 501c3.
Pretty much.
Tax status.
And also
permission
church
from the
incorporation.
IRS, and yeah.
Church incorporation.
So you don't ascribe to that, and you
No, I
have
don't.
I know you have an organization, or
I don't.
you're part of a movement anyway of unregistered churches, is it?
Well, we can be called Free New Testament churches or unregistered churches, and a lot of people don't understand the issue. We believe that there's no reason, there's no law in America that says a church should be incorporated or that a church needs to be licensed, but something changes very radically when it does, and a majority of churches have been sort of sucked into this trap, and now they've taken a voluntary
Didn't they
muzzle.
padlock some of these churches
Oh, yeah.
that were...
Oh, yeah. And see, the issue is once you've signed up for the 501c3 tax exemption recognition, or you've incorporated the church, now you've taken on a group of regulations that you're supposed to uphold. And one of them, of course, is not to speak against public policy.
Right.
Just the same as in the day with
And
King
a
George.
corporation is actually a creation of the
Artificial
government.
creation.
Anyway. Yeah, right.
Owes its allegiance to its creator. And so the issue is, and this is how I explain it to people. In fact, the other night I was a chaplain for a political event with a gubernatorial candidate, and they were going to do the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag first. And I said, that's incorrect. And he said, really? But I've always done it this way. And I said, well, then you've always done it incorrectly. And I guess I'm big enough and old enough to say stuff like that to people without any fear, because I know I'm right.
And
See, the issue
what's
is,
the way they...
well,
traditionally-
invocation is always first, because who gave us civil government? According to Romans 13 in the Bible, God gave us government. Government didn't give us God. You see?
Right,
And-
even our Declaration of Independence, it recognizes...
Absolutely. And also, by the way,
Creator.
a little earlier in our conversation, we were talking about the Declaration. There's an important point there that many people miss. There's actually 28 different indictments against the British king and the British government that are in the Declaration. But one of the points that's made there is that we're submitting to the world our intentions. In other words, and see, a lot of people don't know that actually the colonies sent the olive branch petition way before the Battle of Lexington saying, you know, we're not getting along, we haven't gotten along, and I'm just paraphrasing here, we haven't gotten along for a lot of years, but we know that we're British subjects and we're under British common law and so forth. We'd like to work it out.
Right.
And of course, the Declaration says there was no response. That's not exactly true. There was a response. It was called 700 Redcoats coming up what's Massachusetts Avenue to intimidate them into submission.
And then
that was the
Bunker Hill.
response. And Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill. Yeah.
That year.
That's right. So they were submitting themselves to the review of the world, saying, hey, we're standing against a tyrant king, and we want the whole world to know what our intentions and why we're doing it. This was very principled. This was not just like the French Revolution where, you know, the guillotine was invented and Robespierre, he ended up being killed on his own device. And of course, he even said at the end, well, you know, as a government, I guess we're going to have to give the people a God because people need God. But see, in America, it was the reverse. God gave us a good civil government, and it was supposed to be within certain confines. And when it started to go past those confines, then we, the people, were supposed to do something about it. So who was supposed to take the moral high ground to speak? But the church, and that's where the Black Robe Regiment, and I'm glad to say that I am a modern embodiment of the 21st century Black Robe Regiment. I'm doing the same things they did. I stood on the Lexington Green many times. The most recent time, of course, you and I were there, but in 2007 on April 19th, and they wanted me to get a permit. And I said, I'll take the same permit that Jonas Clark had, thank you. Is it because I'm a rebel? No. It's because I know what the freedom and liberty of America is about. And I'm going to stand for that the way my ancestors. I got 388 years of ancestry in this country. And, you know, when we were talking about growing up, You know, Walter, when you're growing up, most of the time you don't listen to your parents all that much. You got other things on your mind. But I listened enough to know this, that my ancestors fought and died. They bled, they prayed, they paid. And I started to realize if they were here right now, what would they say about what's happening in this country? And I know what they would say. Do you know how I know? Because I have read what they wrote.
Well, that's the other thing. This isn't being taught today. It's so obscure. I was even down at that Lexington Historical Society. They had no idea about anything with this Jonas Clark. You know, I mean, it's almost of how he encouraged the men that night. You want to share a little more about it that night when he encouraged the men?
It was actually, it was 5:30 in the morning.
Okay.
I mean, he came out on the village green risking his own life, and he was, in a sense, not necessarily a combatant, okay? The people in his congregation did not want him to go into battle, but many of the Black Robe Regiment did fight. William Emerson, the grandfather of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was William Emerson
Concord.
was at Concord at the bridge, later died at Fort Ticonderoga, so many of them did fight. In the case of Jonas Clark, it had been decided, come out and give us a rousing message to encourage us, and basically the theme of it was, quit ye like men, which for 18th century language was, be of good courage, come on, stand up straight, don't be afraid, do what's right in God's sight. And he gave them a message from the 6th and 7th chapter of the book of Judges about the Gideon's army, saying, yeah. And I have delivered that same message. In fact, that's been recorded and it's on DVD.
That's an incredible story.
It really is. I mean, it's an incredible story of common people knowing who they were in Christ and knowing what the Bible says and knowing about liberty and freedom and saying, we will stand our ground against all opposition. And I'll tell you, Walter, I'm proud to be an American. I mean, I know today we get bashed all over the place, but I'm proud of the original intent of this country, of people who have come from all over the world to have a quality of life that they've never had anywhere else because of those people that fought on that green and what they fought for. And not just them, but I mean, Valley Forge, I had ancestors at Valley Forge that were eating their shoe leather. You know, that's another whole story of how the Tories told the British where they could find the supplies that were being saved up for the Continental Army up in Valley Forge. And can you imagine, you're practically naked, you're freezing, you're starving, and you're expecting, well, if we get to Valley Forge, we'll be okay. And you get there and find out, without firing a shot, they just took the stuff and went and laughed at them. This is big. I mean, when you think about the 8 years of bloody war concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, it was big. It was big.
About the education today, it's not taught in the public schools. Some of these principles, that's what I find disturbing, is that it's lost, and I don't think it's by accident. It's by device. Design.
It's by device and design.
And they're obscure, and that it's the principles. These are eternal principles. It's not just something that happened 200 plus years ago, but they're just as relevant today as they are 100 years from now.
That's true, because they're about the cause of mankind. That's what Jonas Clark said, from this day forward will be dated the freedom of mankind. This is the cause of mankind. And so today we have people that I'm sure Jonas Clark and others of that era would have said they're traitors, because they're revisionist historians. They don't tell the truth of what actually happened because it doesn't fit their sensibility. It's not politically correct. It doesn't work towards a one world government. Doesn't work towards reducing the sovereignty of America. And I believe in a sovereign America, that we make decisions according to what's best for America. Do we want peace in the world? Yes. Do we want to work in cooperation with other nations?
Friendship and trade. Yep.
But not at the elimination of our sovereignty of what's best for America. I mean, I don't want somebody sitting in Antwerp, Belgium, or in Brussels, Belgium, or in Munich, Germany, making decisions for me. For that matter, I can tell you that the way the colonials believed, they believed that town meeting was important.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. Making a town meeting. That's what we're trying to do with this modern day committees of safety. is bring that back to the community and the state level.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing, Walter, and I think that using the terminology that was used then is important. There's a historical significance for it, and there's a basis for it, and I am hoping and praying, and I'm dedicating my life, as I know you are, to bringing people back to the principles that have made America strong, the strongest nation on earth ever, and the most free people the world has ever known.